Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Matt here, and today we're going to be going over my updated list for the best decks to be playing in ranked mode right now in Pokemon TCG Pocket for this A3 ranked season. Now, we are just about a week into it. I believe at this point, a lot of the people who are, of course, grinding ranked battles a lot are probably already in Master Rank, but this video should help people not only reach Master Rank if you haven't got there yet, but also help the people looking to climb Master Rank as high in the ranks as possible. So of course, this video is going to be based around all of the metadata that we have so far, what I believe the current meta shares and meta landscape looks like, as well as my experience playing in Master Ball rank over the last 4 or 5 days or whatever it's been. So here we go, let's get right into it. So the first things, by the way guys, don't forget to like and subscribe. One thing you guys might not know is throughout all of the people that watch all of my videos, which has been incredible and I really appreciate it, like over 80% of you guys aren't subscribed. So definitely consider hitting that subscribe button, it would help out the channel a lot. So I just wanted to go ahead and say that. Okay. So we're gonna start this video by talking about the decks that are the most popular decks in Pokemon Pocket right now in ranked battles. That's typically where we want to start because that's where we'll kind of get an idea of what decks we should be playing or trying to play a counter to, you know what I mean? So that's really where we're gonna start. And the first deck is of course Giratina and Darkrai. Now, if you guys watched my tier list on Tuesday, which if you haven't, I would go check that out. On my tier list, I put 3 decks in S tier. Most predominantly, I did put Giratina and Darkrai up there in the S tier. This is the most popular deck, if not the second most popular deck in Pokemon Pocket right now, especially in ranked battles and especially in Master Ball rank. For good reason. Giratina Darkrai is objectively the best deck in Pokemon Pocket. Giratina EX is the best card, the best Pokemon in Pokemon Pocket, so this is kind of the default way that people are playing it. A lot of people are already experienced with this deck, having played it probably a lot in the previous format, which makes sense why it's still seeing a lot of play. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, is Giratina Darkrai really still the most played deck, and is it still the best deck? And to be fair, it is and it isn't in some ways. So for whatever the reason, in this new expansion of Celestial Guardians, we got Oricorio, which of course is really the direct counterplay to Giratina and Darkrai. Now, what we saw was Oricorio do extremely well in the first week or so of competitive play and in ranked mode, and yeah, I think that it's still really relevant, but for whatever the reason, so many people have either decided to counterplay Oricorio or just counterplay Giratina Darkrai without playing Oricorio. And it's kind of created this really weird environment, and this is definitely going to lead us to the second deck, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but we all know about Giratina and Darkrai, again, against basically everything in the format that's not per se Oricorio, or maybe Meowscarada. We do extremely well against all of the fire decks we do well against, even Giratina with Snorlax we do really well against, Garchomp and the fighting decks we do well against. There's really not a lot in the game right now that is a direct counter, or a deck realistically that does well against Giratina Darkrai. Our options are very limited. In fact, really all 3 of the options that are good against this deck have also made the list in today's video, but Giratina Darkrai always does what it needs to do. It has the inherent advantage of playing 2 really strong basic EX Pokemon with a lot of HP that have a lot of synergy. So in this deck list, we are playing Mars. You could even play 1 extra copy of Mars or a red card to further disrupt your opponents. That's what we're actually seeing a lot with Giratina Darkrai, is a lot of hand disruption, mainly to help counter a lot of the Stage 2 decks that you're going to be seeing that rely on that Rare Candy Stage 2 combination, which again is a little bit inconsistent in its own right, and especially against Meowscarada with the Sprigatito Cry for Help. Red card and Mars early in the game is extraordinarily useful. So we're seeing those hand disruption cards much more commonly in Giratina and Darkrai right now, and then commonly we do see some of these damage modifying tool cards, things like Rocky Helmet and Poison Barb, which again, we kind of allow to whittle down our opponent's Pokemon to set up some KOs on some of those big Stage 2 Pokemon, but also, again, things like Meowscarada maybe with their Leaf Cape, things like that. Now, we're not playing Guzma in here, but again, I would also recommend maybe thinking about playing a Guzma. It's particularly good against the mirror matchup, but also good against those grass decks. Like I said, with the Leaf Cape, that 30 extra HP that they get is pretty useful, and again, that matchup isn't necessarily great for Darkrai decks, so I would also suggest maybe playing Guzma. But in this list, we're playing 2 copies of Leaf, so this is more of a consistency deck, or consistency build. 2 potions, no Pokemon Center Lady, but Sabrina, Cyrus, Red, Mars, and 2 copies of Leaf. So definitely some flexibility there. And I think this is a certainly good way to play it. The core of the deck is going to remain the same. So regardless of what tool cards or trainer cards or supporter cards that we're throwing in this deck list, it's going to kind of do the same thing most of the time. One thing I would consider though right now, if you are playing Giratina Darkrai, is consider playing something like Guzma or, Mars or Red card. Those are really good disruptive cards that are really good against some of the matchups that, Giratina Darkrai is going to be going up against pretty commonly in this format. So secondly, then probably either the second most played deck or the number 1 most played deck in the format right now is actually going to be Giratina with Snorlax. Now, this is the deck that won the Ursa Days tournament this past weekend, and we'll have to see if this weekend Snorlax can pull out the W once again. I don't necessarily think it will, but again, you never really know. It is definitely a really good quality deck list. The main issue with this deck, and I'm going to say this right now, is that it is not great against Giratina and Darkrai. So why would we be playing Snorlax and Giratina if it loses to Giratina with Darkrai? And it does, by the way. All of the metadata tells us that this matchup against Giratina Darkrai, if you're playing Snorlax, is not favored. It's realistically not a great matchup for you. So why would we be choosing to play Snorlax and Giratina? Well, I mean, traditionally, the reason why you would play Snorlax and Giratina with Greninja here is because we're really good against Oricorio. This is predominantly a counter Oricorio deck that, of course, does have just a strong enough, sort of strategy to beat really anything in the format, at least sometimes. So if you're really hedging your bets against Oricorio, this is a really strong deck because at least you do have an option to beat decks that aren't Oricorio, but certainly have a really good chance against Oricorio. So that's really where Snorlax and Giratina falls into play. But again, we're not actually seeing that much Oricorio in competitive and in ranked battles right now in Pokemon Pocket. Again, for whatever the reason, I think realistically the last week or so, a lot of counter Oricorio decks have emerged, which again has pushed Oricorio farther down for sure in the meta share and just much less common in ranked battles for sure. But again, what it's doing is creating a really open path for Giratina and Darkrai. So I don't necessarily understand why things are going this way. I understand that this is the deck that won the Ursa Days tournament, so a lot of eyes are on this deck list, and it is a strong deck, so I guess I understand why it's seeing so much play, but really all we're doing by playing Snorlax Giratina is opening up an open pathway for not only the fighting decks, which are strong against us with Snorlax, but we're opening up a clear pathway for Giratina and Darkrai, which is not something I think most players should be interested in doing. I think a lot of people would rather not see a bunch of Giratina and Darkrai, but again, the 2 most played decks are Giratina Darkrai and a deck that is not good against Giratina Darkrai. So hopefully something changes and hopefully we see maybe a different deck win the Ursa Days tournament this weekend, because winning the tournament doesn't necessarily mean that it's the best deck list. It just sort of happened to get a little bit lucky in its day 2 matchups. And again, this is a really strong deck, so I do want to put it on this list. I'm not talking down about it. You are going to do really well against a variety of different decks, predominantly Oricorio decks, but your matchups against fighting as well as Giratina Darkrai aren't necessarily winning matchups. In fact, they're losing matchups. So I don't know if I would necessarily recommend this deck list as high as some of the other ones on this list, but in this video we have 7 or 8 different decks, so it definitely makes that top 8 list. But again, I would probably recommend maybe moving off of this particular deck, and hopefully we can push Giratina Darkrai out of the format at least a little bit more than what we have been doing over the last week. That's my hope, at least. I don't know how many people are going to watch this. Again, if you love Snorlax, then play it, but again, all you're doing is really opening up a pathway for Giratina and Darkrai to still dominate the format, which is kind of disappointing, I would say, but you know what? It is what it is. I'm going to take a drink of water real quick. We might have to edit that out of the video. That was a long drink. Okay. All right. So there's Snorlax, Greninja, and Giratina. Now, what is the other Giratina deck? Again, in my tier list, I put all 3 Giratina decks that are focused around Giratina in the S tier because I do think that they're the best decks in Pokemon Pocket right now. This is the other option. So very similarly to the Snorlax deck, it is Giratina with Greninja. Instead of Snorlax, we are playing Oricorio. So this is, again, very similar to the Snorlax deck. In fact, instead of being strong against Oricorio and being weak to Giratina Darkrai, we are playing Oricorio, which means we're strong against Giratina Darkrai, but we're weak against Snorlax. So there's definitely this rock, paper, scissors at the top of the metagame. This particular deck list here seemingly always has the highest win rate in ranked battles for me, but also the highest win rate in tournaments, but it's never the most played. I think a lot of people just in general aren't super interested in playing the little electric bird. They just kind of don't like that gameplay aspect of it. But again, it's either you play Oricorio or enough people play Oricorio or Giratina Darkrai takes over. And that's realistically what the format is right now. Oricorio is the predominant counter to Giratina Darkrai. So I would still highly recommend this deck. Again, when I'm playing ranked battles, I see a ton of fire. I see a ton of, Decidueye decks, Giratina Darkrai decks, and of course a lot of Snorlax. So you kind of have to hedge your bets a little bit. This deck list here isn't even that terrible against Garchomp. It is really bad against Rampardos, so you might be fighting decks that aren't Garchomp, but again, Oricorio is still immune to Garchomp, so we can rely a little bit on Greninja and Giratina to handle the other Pokemon on that deck, or just hope that they don't draw their fossils. Realistically, the matchup against Garchomp for this list isn't even that bad. Again, we are going to struggle against Snorlax, but it's still winnable. Because we're playing 2 Greninja and 2 Giratina, we always have a route to win games without utilizing Oricorio. But we are playing Oricorio, which means that in the matchups where Oricorio is really good, then yeah, we're obviously going to win those matchups as well, which is why I believe this deck list always has a really, really high win rate, even though it really hasn't caught on, even though it's traditionally a deck that always has a really high win rate. In fact, amongst all of the most played decks, this is amongst the highest in terms of average win rate. And for good reason, like I said, it's Oricorio, but it's the most flexible way to play Oricorio. And again, really good against Giratina Darkrai. So yes, those are the 3 decks that I wanted to cover right off the bat, predominantly because all of the Giratina decks, I think, are at the top of the metagame. But again, what I was talking about earlier was what decks are most common. And again, the most common decks are the first 2 decks that we talked about, right? Giratina Darkrai and then Giratina with Snorlax. Most of the time on the ladder, these are the 2 decks that you're going to be going up against. So that being said, what other decks that aren't Giratina should we be playing in ranked battles right now? Well, I have 4 options that I think are the best 4 options, and let's get right into them. So the next one is going to be Garchomp. Garchomp is a deck that absolutely took over ranked battles and competitive metagame for 3, 4, or even 5 days after the Ursa Days tournament. Again, it's a deck list that's really strong against Oricorio, but also really strong against Snorlax. And because Snorlax is probably one of, if not the most played deck right now, fighting is a pretty good choice. Now, Garchomp doesn't necessarily have a great matchup against Giratina Darkrai, but what it does have is a decent matchup and a good enough matchup to where you can sometimes win those games. Garchomp with Rampardos both have 1 energy in their attack cost. So whether we're going second and we can kind of go into Garchomp on our, or not Garchomp, but Rampardos on our second turn, or we're going first, and on our second turn we can go into Garchomp, we have a lot of options here. It's a really, really fast-paced deck. In fact, what we're actually seeing in the metagame, truthfully, as far as rare candy goes, is that realistically most of the rare candy decks that are the most relevant are all stage 2 Pokemon with 1 energy in their attack cost. So it's just kind of interesting to note, whether it's Garchomp, Rampardos, Charizard, or Incineroar, those are the most common stage 2 Pokemon that are seeing play competitively, and I think it kind of makes sense, right? Rare Candy, 1 energy, attack cost stage 2 Pokemon gives them those really fast-paced, sort of explosive potential, but Garchomp is still a really good option. Now, I think that there's a lot of ways that we can play Rampardos. I've seen it, of course, with Lucario. I've seen it with Lycanroc. I think Rampardos as a card in general is just really, really good. Now, Garchomp, of course, is immune, or I should say, Oricorio is immune to Garchomp, but Garchomp can hit the bench, so Garchomp is still a really, really strong Pokemon. We're playing 1 copy of Cyrus in this deck and 1 copy of Lily, with 1 Iono, 1 Red, and 2 Pokemon Center. Or no, 2 Professor's Research and 1 Pokemon Communications. Now, 1 Pokeball is actually correct for this deck, I will say, because we're only playing 2 basic Pokemon, so you don't really need 2 Pokeball. Now, one thing I will say is that I'm not actually a massive fan of Iono, at least in Stage 2 decks. And I'll talk about it a little bit right now. Now, I don't think Iono is a bad card, but predominantly for the Stage 2 Rare Candy decks, I definitely think Pokemon Communications is a better card. The reason for that is that oftentimes you're going to have in your hand either Rare Candy or a Stage 2 Pokemon, but not the other piece of the combination. So we have one of the 2 cards that we need to, of course, Rare Candy and then go into our Stage 2 Pokemon. And having only 1 copy of those cards in our hand and then playing Iono gets rid of one of those cards for that combination. Whereas, if we weren't playing Iono, then we just hopefully draw off the top deck one of the cards that we need. If you play Iono, there's no guarantee that we're gonna trade away one of those combo pieces for 2 of those combo pieces. It just doesn't feel very good. Now, Iono's not a terrible card. There are gonna be times where you're absolutely bricking and your hand is full of your Stage 2 Pokemon and useless supporters. So Iono can be useful in that turn 3, turn 4, turn 5 range if we're kind of bricking. But to be fair, if we haven't done anything by turn 3, 4, or 5, then we're probably going to lose the game anyway. So I don't really necessarily feel like in these Rare Candy Stage 2 decks that Iono provides that much value. whereas Pokemon Communications definitely does, because let's just say we have our basic in play, which we always will, and we have that rare candy in hand, then we can maybe trade off one of these Pokemon that isn't, of course, the Pokemon that we need for a more likely approach for that Pokemon that we need. So for Stage 2 decks with Rare Candy, I like Pokemon Communications, but I'm not necessarily super high on Iono. If I'm playing Garchomp, I'm definitely considering cutting this Iono and maybe even cutting Red as well to play an extra Cyrus or maybe an extra Lily. Really, really good cards for the mirror matchup, but in general, 2 cards that are really, really good to heal up our Garchomp or, again, to sort of bring up a bench Pokemon. Having 2 Cyrus in the deck gives this deck a lot more consistency with that Cyrus needing to draw into it early on. I personally think that this deck is good because it encompasses really all of the cards that you might consider running in Garchomp, but for me personally, I put a little bit more weight in things like Pokemon Communications, like Lily, and like Cyrus when I'm playing Garchomp. So anyway, there it is. Garchomp really, really good. Again, it's got a decent matchup spread across the format, but again, Oricorio isn't seeing that much play right now, so when you're playing Garchomp, you're kind of hopefully just hitting a bunch of Snorlaxes, and that's really the upside to playing fighting right now, is that it is really good against Snorlax. However, you're going to kind of struggle against Giratina Darkrai. So it actually kind of functions as an opposite to the Oricorio decks that we talked about earlier, like this deck, right? Which does really good against Giratina Darkrai, but struggles against Snorlax. Garchomp and the fighting decks are kind of the opposite, right? So if you want to have a better matchup against Snorlax, but not so much against Giratina Darkrai, you would play fighting because you also have a good matchup against Oricorio. So I think fighting is really well positioned in the format, especially in ranked battles. You kind of have to just play towards whatever you're going to be going up against more commonly. And when you're playing Garchomp, you're probably hoping to play, Oricorio decks and Snorlax decks, most predominantly, but you're probably going to hit a lot of mirror matches as well. Garchomp definitely really common in the format right now. Now, that being said, what other deck list is sort of another sort of flex deck that's outside of that sort of top of the meta rock, paper, scissors deck? Another great example of that is actually Arceus, Crobat, and Cardivine. This deck has gotten a ton of momentum over the last week. It has a consistently good win rate in tournaments, but I also think that it's a really effective deck in ranked mode as well. Again, when Garchomp was really popular, this deck actually did really well. Most people were running if we go back, most people are running this fighting type Gibble, but I actually don't think that this is correct as well. I probably should have noted. I don't think that it's worth, at least currently if you're playing ranked battles, to play the fighting type Gibble. Yes, you are going to be able to hit for weakness on things like Snorlax, and you are going to be able to hit for weakness on things like Oricorio, but you're going to get absolutely bodied if you run into a Cardivine, and this deck is actually a lot more common than you might think. This is a really good quality deck, and I do think that it's actually fairly well positioned in the sense that you can kind of split your matchups in terms of what you're good and bad against. So Arceus and Cardivine and Crobat is really a kind of interesting deck list. I personally never thought that this deck would be that consistent, because you have to think that for this deck to really function the way it wants to, you have to lead with Cardivine, which is only 1/3 of the Pokemon in your deck, because if you lead with Arceus or you lead with Zubat, there's no guarantee that you're going to be able to do anything, especially if you lead with Arceus. It really does kind of feel bad. So most of the time, if you lead with Arceus, you're probably going to lose the game. However, if you do lead Cardivine and you do get Arceus on your bench and you do get Crobat set up, this deck is absolutely phenomenal. So even though we're not playing any, we are playing a stage 2 Pokemon, but even though we're playing mostly basic Pokemon with this deck, it definitely feels like a little bit of an RNG roller coaster and a bit of like a high roller deck where we're really just hoping we draw the right cards and we get them in the right sequences, because if we do, the deck is really, really strong. Of course, if you lead with Cardivine and Arceus is on your bench, then that's 50 damage right off the bat, which is really, really strong. And then again, we can set up our Arceus on the bench, get that Crobat down. Crobat plus Cardivine is 80 damage per turn. And then again, a full benched Arceus with Crobat is 130 plus 30, that's 160. So there are a lot of scenarios where this deck can win. Again, Cardivine's going to be really good against those fighting decks, hitting for weakness, but it's also really good against Oricorio because, of course, we're doing 50 damage for 1 energy, and we can KO this Oricorios pretty early on. And in general, I think the deck is pretty good. Now, against Garchomp, it's actually interesting because Arceus and Crobat, of course, are weak to fighting, which means that realistically, if we're playing against Garchomp and we aren't able to utilize Cardivine, our matchup against Garchomp in Rampardos really isn't that good, especially because Garchomp can hit the bench and they can bring up our Arceus or our Crobat with Cyrus. So it's a really interesting deck list. Again, if we're playing the Dragon type Gibble in Garchomp, I actually think we do pretty well against Arceus and Crobat, but in general, this is definitely a pretty good deck list. It is also a deck that does not do that well against Giratina Darkrai. You might think it does. Its win rate is not great against Giratina Darkrai, and our matchups against Snorlax, I think, is fairly even. But again, our matchups against Garchomp are a little bit more even than you might think as well. So it's just sort of an interesting placement deck, but its overall win rate is actually quite high. So as far as like the best decks to play in ranked mode go, I had to include it on the list because it's sort of that interesting sort of like one of those really interesting decks that kind of fits fairly nicely into the metagame. And it's a really, really strong deck. Crobat can utilize Rare Candy really effectively. So I think that it's worth mentioning. And again, we're probably going to be talking about this deck pretty consistently, and it's probably going to be topping tournaments pretty consistently as well. Just a strong deck that's fairly well positioned in the metagame. So I wanted to mention it because, again, it does fairly well against the fighting decks while also doing good against Oricorio and having at least a winnable matchup against some of the Giratina decks. So definitely quite strong. Next up, we're going to talk about Magnezone and Oricorio, and then lastly, we'll talk about Meowscarada because that's the one I want to leave for last. Because that's sort of my spicy pick for the week. So the 7th deck on our list is going to be Magnezone with Oricorio. So this is sort of the pure Electric-type Oricorio deck. A lot of people may feel like this isn't a great deck list. So it's interesting because we get absolutely destroyed by fighting, and we aren't necessarily that great against Snorlax. It's a kind of a fairly like 50-50 matchup, but the upside to Oricorio and Magnezone is that we should almost always beat any water decks, have a decent matchup, a good matchup, I should say, against the fire decks, and good matchups against Giratina Darkrai with Oricorio. And that's really where this deck fits. So if you wanted to play Oricorio, but you wanted to play just a little bit less of a flex version of it, like the Greninja version, which is right here, then Magnezone and Oricorio are, where is it? Right here. Magnezone and Oricorio is a really good option for you because this is a deck list that is not necessarily as flexible in its matchups, but very, very strong against the particular matchups that you're playing. The average win rate for this deck is always really high. It always performs well. It did get 2nd place at the Ursa Days tournament. So I think that whether you're playing ranked mode or you're playing tournaments, this is still a pretty volatile pick because depending on your matchups, you're going to win a lot of the time. But you also could lose a lot of the time. So expect to win a bunch of games in a row, but lose a bunch of games in a row, and have a lot of your sort of wins and losses kind of determined by your matchups and not so much the gameplay and how you're playing the game. That's really what this deck list kind of comes down to. But it's still really, really good. We're playing Guzma, we're playing some healing cards like Pokemon Center Lady, some Giant Capes to keep Oricorio alive. And again, the whole idea here is we keep Oricorio in the active, we set up Magnezone, we whittle down our opponent with Oricorio, and the cool thing about this deck is that we can go into Oricorio, then go into Magnezone, take a KO, and if we get Revenge KO, that's fine, we go back into Oricorio, set up another Magnezone, and finish the game with that Magnezone. That's really sort of the line with this deck list. But again, from a matchup perspective, it is a little bit volatile. Really good against some decks, really, really bad against other decks. Just hope that you hit the matchups that you probably want to hit when you're playing this particular deck. That's kind of really what it comes down to. Certainly is still a good deck list. Again, we are talking about the top 8 decks to play for ranked mode right now. There's other things that, again, we could put on this list, and we'll kind of leave some honorable mentions towards the end, but we'll talk about maybe why some other decks aren't on the list. So lastly, let's talk about the final deck that we're going to talk about today, which is actually Grass. So yes, Grass, I think, has its time to shine right now in the metagame, and Grass is in a very, very interesting position. Now, Meowscarada is a really good card. Decidueye is a really, really good card. This is a deck list that I think is as well positioned right now, currently in the metagame, as really any other deck that you could possibly be playing. Now, this deck does have its consistency issues with Sprigatito, with all of the Stage 2 Pokemon, with Cry for Help. You should at least sort of get all of the Pokemon that you need. The other thing, though, is that all of these decks are kind of playing Red Card and they're playing Mars. So you're going to get hit with that early Mars pretty often. So one thing you need to keep in mind with this deck is that sometimes you have to sacrifice that one Sprigatito. Now, if you don't have to sacrifice the Sprigatito, then that's obviously a really good thing, but oftentimes you kind of want to set up the second Sprigatito on your bench and set up the second Rowlet and just sort of, suicide this, or not suicide, but like kamikaze this Sprigatito in the active to just cry for help until you get KO'd, and hopefully you can kind of win the game with just one Meowscarada and one Decidueye. Against a lot of matchups, that should be enough, but this deck list is really, really, really strong. 2 Leaf Cape to bring Meowscarada up to 170, or bring Decidueye up to 200, plus 2 Ericas to further increase the healing and the survivability of all of our cards. This is a really, really good deck. Again, it is going to struggle a little bit in consistency. None of our Pokemon that are Stage 2 here, either Meowscarada or Decidueye, have 1 energy in their attack cost, which means this deck does not feel very good going first. In fact, it feels quite bad going first. So that's one downside to this list. But the upside to playing Grass right now is that we have, in playing Meowscarada with Grass predominantly, is that we have good matchups into Giratina Darkrai. Of course, Meowscarada is really good into Giratina Darkrai, but we're also good into the fighting decks. So in a format where there's not necessarily, that much, I guess, counterplay to Grass, I think Fire, which isn't on the list right now, you might be asking, Fire is kind of on the outs a little bit. I just feel like Fire isn't as well positioned as maybe it should be, and it isn't doing as well as it should be. So I think for the most part, you could talk about, you know, Incineroar and Charizard, and you could put it on this list. I thought about it. It would probably be the 9th deck on this list, but I also feel like I haven't been playing a lot of Fire in the format. So for that reason, I think that Grass is actually really well positioned right now. A lot of fighting, a lot of Giratina Darkrai, and even if it's not Giratina Darkrai, it's probably Snorlax or Oricorio, which again, we have decent to good matchups against all of those decks. So as long as we're not playing Fire, which like I said, Fire isn't very common currently, at least in my experience in competitive, but also in Master Ball and in ranked battles, Grass is really well positioned, and this is probably the best way to be playing Grass currently right now. Decidueye is a really, really strong card, and so is Meowscarada. Again, the only downside to this particular deck is that none of our Pokemon have 1 energy in their attack cost, so realistically, we're not doing anything unless we are on our 3rd turn going first, or a 2nd turn going 2nd, which can be a little bit slow, but that slow sort of aspect of the deck actually adheres to its consistency a little bit, which is why I said oftentimes we kind of want to suicide or kamikaze. I keep saying suicide. We want to kamikaze this particular Sprigatito and let it, you know, just kind of get KO'd in the active while we cry for help and set up all of our Pokemon. Definitely reliant on getting those rare candies, but, you know, it is what it is. We're not playing Iono or, you know, Pokemon Communications in this deck, but you don't really need it with the cry for help. We're definitely reliant on that effect. We're going to get absolutely kind of thrown by an early Mars or an early red card, but that's just the nature of the game and setup decks like this. But no, I do think Meowscarada and Decidueye is probably the most well-positioned deck in the format right now. I think it's a really, really smart meta play. It's something that I've had the most success with in Master Ball rank, but also a deck that I think is going to be doing really well in tournaments as well. We'll have to see this weekend exactly what happens, but given the metagame and what decks people are playing right now, other than Fire, we do really, really good if we're playing Grass and Meowscarada and Decidueye. Again, our worst enemy other than Fire is ourselves and the consistency downside to this deck and red card and Mars, but hopefully we dodge those particular cards and we dodge the Fire decks, and we should have a really good matchup spread throughout everything in the format. The other cool thing about this deck is that we're only playing 1 Decidueye, 1 Rowlet. So the reason why we're doing that is because basically we're very, very reliant on you know, the cry for help. But this makes cry for help more consistent, right? If we remove the stage 1 from the Rowlet line, if we do get Rowlet on our bench with Pokeball, or if we get all of our basic Pokemon down, then we're basically guaranteed to get either Floragato or our stage 2 Pokemon with cry for help, which is certainly really good. So you're going to have to keep that in mind, right? We have really 3 stage 2 Pokemon, and 2 of them have to get evolved with rare candy, which means we're always having to evolve Rowlet with rare candy. So you have to keep that in mind if you're playing the deck list like this, and you have to keep that rare candy in hand to evolve that Decidueye, and hopefully you can utilize Floragato, but it's a little bit of a gameplay sort of, I guess, you know, thought process is sort of understanding when and where to use that rare candy and when to save it. But I do think that cutting out the Dartrix from this deck is actually quite good, and makes Cry for Help a little bit more consistent. And again, we don't really need it because against, you know, or Oricorio, Meowscarada can kind of just carry. So that's sort of how I feel about this particular deck. And Rowlet can actually put in work as well, doing 10 damage to take a KO on the bench as well, which is pretty cool. But yeah, there it is. That's Meowscarada and Decidueye, what I believe is actually the most well-positioned deck in the metagame right now, and would actually be kind of my, if you're not going to play any of these 3 most played decks, you know, in ranked mode, I would actually probably recommend playing Meowscarada the most, playing Meowscarada Grass with Decidueye. I think it's really, really well positioned. Okay. So that's it, guys. That's my list. Now, you might be wondering, what about this deck? What about that deck? Again, I think that, you know, the other Rampardos decks are still really, really good. If you wanted to play fighting, but you didn't want to play Garchomp, you could play Lycanroc, you could play Lucario. I think you're going to be doing fairly well with those fighting decks. But I also think you could play Fire, you could play Charizard or Incineroar, and I think that they're totally fine, but I just don't really feel that they're as good as the other decks that we've talked about on this list, and I don't think you're going to win as many games by playing those particular decks, especially in Master Ball rank. That's sort of how I feel. You have a decent matchup against Giratina Darkrai, but again, you're going to get beat by Oricorio, and you're kind of going to struggle a little bit in some other matchups as well. So Fire doesn't feel as good for me. It's just outside that top 10, and that's sort of how I feel. Those are kind of my honorable mentions, but anyway, guys, that's the video. Hopefully you guys found this interesting. Like I said, it's been a week since we did our previous video talking about the best decks for ranked mode, and a lot has changed, so I wanted to make this update video, and I wanted to tell you guys what I believe are sort of my updated list of best decks to be playing for ranked mode, and hopefully you guys enjoy this video, and hopefully it's useful for you guys, and hopefully everybody hits Master Ball. If you haven't already, hopefully you climb as high as possibly in Master Ball rank, and you get that top 10,000, top 5,000, maybe even top 1,000 if you're ready to play a lot of games. So hopefully this video helps, and yes, this weekend is the second Ursa Days tournament of the Celestial Guardians format, which I'm really, really excited about. Now, for the people that are wondering if I'm going to be live tomorrow night on YouTube, I don't believe I will be able to go live tomorrow, but we might go live Sunday, so keep that in mind for sure. Definitely, tune in if we are end up going live. But anyway, join the Discord to stay notified for all of that stuff. Link will be down in the description below. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's get out of here, guys. Peace out. Have a good one. We kept this one about 30 minutes, which I'm kind of proud of, so there you go. There you go. All right. Peace out, guys. Have a good one. We'll see you guys later. And yeah. Bye.